Thank you, Ingrid, and hello, good afternoon to everyone. I want to just extend a welcome from the Children's Bureau and thank everyone for joining this call this afternoon and giving your time, and especially would like to thank those that are presenting today. Appreciate your providing your expertise on this topic, developing an adoption competent network of providers. This is a very important topic for the entire adoption community, and I know this will be very worthwhile for all of you involved. So thank you, and I will hand it, I believe, on to Leslie.
Welcome, everybody. My name is Leslie Cohen, and I'm the Project Director for the QIC-AG. I will be joined today by Dr. Vinod Shilani, Heather Forbes, John Webb, and Barbara Joyle. We're going to start with a little bit of an overview on the QIC-AG for those of you who may not be familiar. The QIC is funded through a 5-year cooperative agreement with the Department of Health and Human Services, Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau, and we're ending the 4th year of our program. We'll be launching into our 5th and final year as we end in September of 2019. Our partners are Spalding for Children, University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, University of Texas at Austin, and University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. The goals of the QIC-AG are to develop an evidence-based model of support and intervention that can be replicated or adapted by other child welfare systems across the country. It's our hope that these programs will help families achieve long-term, stable permanence in adoptive and guardianship homes for our target populations. This work would not be possible without the involvement of our 8 partner sites: Wisconsin, Vermont, New Jersey, Illinois, Catawba County in North Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, and the Winnebago Tribe of Nebraska. You are all looking at a word doodle or a word cloud. It's got tons of words in here that help describe the adoption experience. Some are positive, some are less positive, some are negative, and some may reflect individuals' experiences and others may not resonate. One thing that we do know is that while most adoptees are physically and emotionally healthy, adopted children are more likely than non-adoptive children to have significant physical health problems as well as difficulties with emotions, concentration, and behavior. Most often, this increased risk is due to adoptees' exposure to adverse experiences before coming to their adoptive families. As we look at this eco-map, it really shows you how important social service supports are and how support systems in our community can really help us. I think that's true for anybody. If you look at this eco-map, it probably resonates with you or with members of your family. But it's really critical, especially for adoptive families, given what we know, that they have support and a network of providers and people that can help them, that have an understanding of the uniqueness of their adoption situation and their adoption experience. So with that, I'd like to welcome Vinod Shilani, and he's going to speak about partnering with pediatric health providers. Dr. Shilani is the Section Chief of the Adolescent Medicine at Phoenix Children's Hospital and Associate Professor of Pediatrics in the University of Arizona, Phoenix Department of Child Health. He completed his pediatric residency training at Maimonides Medical Center, Brooklyn, New York, and clinical research fellowship in adolescent medicine at Children's Hospital, Los Angeles. He obtained a master's in medical education from the University of Southern California and maintains a strong interest in medical education. Welcome, Dr. Shilani.
Thank you, Leslie, and welcome to today's webinar. And I'd like to share with you today my thoughts about how we can most effectively partner with pediatric healthcare providers in identifying children, youth, and families in adoption and guardianship settings who might be most in need of support. But I'd also love to share with you a little bit about where adoption and where learning about the special needs of children and youth in adoption and guardianship settings fits currently within the training and education of our pediatric healthcare providers. Next slide, please. So this is Gabriel Myers, and I'd like to share with you a little bit about my experience and how I came to this work. So Gabriel was removed from his mother's care in June 2008 when she was found slumped inside her car outside a Florida restaurant with a stash of illegal drugs surrounding her. And early into his time in foster care, investigators determined that Gabriel had previously been sexually molested. Now Gabriel began to act out sexually on other children with whom he had come into contact. As his behavior became more and more challenging, his caregivers resorted more and more to punishment, which only caused him to act out more. Now Gabriel was moved from a foster home to a relative's home and back to a foster home, not unlike the stories of multiple placements that we hear with many of the children and families we work with. On April 16, 2009, while yet in another new placement, Gabriel locked himself in the bathroom and wrapped a detachable shower hose around his neck and hung himself to death. Now, Gabriel's death threw the Florida child welfare system in crisis, especially because he was on psychotropic medications which had just recently been linked by federal regulators to an increased risk of suicide among children without the appropriate consents. Now, in its aftermath, the state put together a task force to address gaps and define how to best approach challenging behavioral and emotional health concerns in children and youth in care. Now, at this time, I had just joined the board of a community-based care agency in Florida, and I was the only pediatrician representative on that group. At that time, I had the privilege of helping inform process improvements and think about how we best engage our pediatric provider community to think about how we best meet the needs of our children and youth in care, especially around behavioral health, and go beyond defining quality as to whether or not the appropriate consents and treatment was in place. And that really sort of began my work in adoption and guardianship settings and getting to understand the system more. Now, while this experience served as my initiation into my involvement in this area, we have to recognize that many of our pediatric providers do not necessarily have the same learning opportunities and the same formative experiences. Next slide. So adoption is primarily a social service, but it is a social service with an important medical component. Now, after the first modern adoption laws first came into effect, adoption practice was really about finding healthy babies for childless couples, and the medical input into the process was minimal. It was essentially healthy newborn babies required a brief physical examination to make sure that they had no major health problems or congenital malformations, and the children who did or had problems were then categorized as unadoptable. Now, by the late 1990s, the face of children seeking adoptive homes had really changed significantly, and they now included older children and youth who had complex physical, developmental, emotional, and educational needs. At the same time, we were also looking at markedly increased numbers of children who were being adopted from abroad. At around this time, a minor subspecialty emerged within the field of pediatrics, and these were pediatricians who truly had an interest in adoptions and called themselves adoption pediatricians. In the year 2000, the American Academy of Pediatrics recognized this new group of providers who could be very helpful in guiding families through various phases of the adoption and guardianship process and formed a section on adoption and foster care. Now, these pediatricians serve several different functions. They may perform pre-adoption medical reviews and assessment. They sometimes may be involved in initial health screening, which we know is required for children and youth that come into care within 72 hours of entry, or in performing their comprehensive physical examinations as they enter out-of-home care, typically within 30 days. Some of these adoption pediatricians also run what you call adoption competent medical homes, where they continue to follow patients and become their primary care medical homes. Now, while we recognize that the field of adoption has changed significantly, we really recognize that there has been a significant lag in how medical services have evolved to meet the needs of children and youth in adoption and guardianship settings. First of all, these pockets of specialization and excellence and niche service, which you often find in academic medical centers, does not necessarily reflect the geography and how our children, youth, and families access care. Additionally, the medical services to support this new population of children has really lagged seriously. When you take a look at who adoption pediatricians are and what their backgrounds, they are typically diplomats who are certified in child abuse pediatrics and who come into this work from that particular background. As of December 31st, 2015, there were only 352 such diplomats who were certified in child abuse pediatrics. Let's talk a little bit about where adoption fits and where learning about the special healthcare needs of children and youth in these settings fit within graduate medical education, specifically within pediatrics. Now, at around the same time that the roster of children and youth in foster care had swelled in the late 1990s, there was also this growing recognition that our pediatricians, especially in their training, had become increasingly locked up in academic medical centers, whereas they were once very involved in community and public health. As a result, there was a move from the Accreditation Council for Graduate Medical Education, which accredits pediatric residency training programs, to bring back experiences that will allow our trainees to have formative experiences working with communities, learning about child advocacy, but especially about learning about the special needs of special population of children and youth who might be at disproportionate risk for poorer health outcomes. At around this time, children and youth in adoption and foster care settings had come to be understood and come to be recognized as a population of children and youth with special health care needs, which was a term that was only previously applied to children and youth who had medical concerns and not necessarily a combination of possibly medical but also significant psychosocial concerns. So when you take a look at these requirements nowadays, these requirements take the form typically of 4 weeks of training for pediatric residents. They can look very differently across different training programs across the country. I had the opportunity to run a similar experience for our residents while during my time in Florida, and we would have our residents, for example, go out with protective investigators and learn about what happens after reports are filed. That way they gain exposure into that system. But again, this can look very differently across different training programs. Additionally, the same requirements for exposure do not exist for family medicine providers who we know care for a large number of children. Additionally, they do not necessarily apply to nurse practitioners or physician assistants who we know care for an increasingly large number of children and youth in this country. One of the things that really sort of folks that try to create interventions and practice change go back to is there a way for us to insert this in medicine? Is there a way for us to bring to put this in either graduate or undergraduate medical education? And the challenge here really is that there's so much competition for limited airtime in graduate medical education, and it's very difficult to figure out what gets into programming and how you program it. So this slide here lists competencies in the care of children and youth in substitute care, which comes from a consensus statement for community pediatrics programs. Some of the competencies that we want our providers to be able to do is to be able to screen children and families for abuse and violence, to identify the unique healthcare needs of patients, and to be able to mobilize resources that may otherwise need. And that was from a 2005 consensus statement. Now, the American Academy of Pediatrics has truly led the way in articulating guiding principles for the medical home for children in foster care and in promoting how it becomes mainstreamed in general pediatric practice. And this slide shows some of the guiding principles that are articulated by the AAP. This includes that a medical home is one where pediatric care is accessible and continuous over the child's time in foster care, regardless of placement. It is one where coordination exists so that we know that the child's mental health, physical health, dental, developmental, and educational needs are identified and addressed. It is one where they receive compassionate care with understanding of the potential impact of trauma and adverse experiences. It is one where care is culturally competent and where stakeholders communicate. And it's also one where there's comprehensive services that are available. So I feel that part of the task here is really to take a step back and think about how do we best train our providers, and what are the requisite competencies for our healthcare providers to be able to meet these guiding principles articulated by the AAP? What are these competencies? One of the things that really has changed since the early 2000s has been our understanding of adverse childhood experiences and its potential impact on lifelong physical, social, and emotional health. What we need are providers who truly understand ACEs and to recognize the populations that are disproportionately impacted by it. Now, we want providers to view child, family, and systems as interacting pieces in a unit, just like the map that Leslie had showed earlier. As far as child factors, we want our providers to be cognizant of the potential difficulties that can come from early adverse experiences, that children who have been abused and neglected, placed in out-of-home care, or institutionalized or drug-exposed may have ongoing emotional, developmental, and physical or behavioral or educational needs. To recognize that these early experiences can result in school concerns and psychosocial stressors. We also want providers to be sensitive to family dynamics and adoption adjustment and to recognize what else might be going on at the level of families. Now, adoptive parents may experience loss and grief issues of their own. They may struggle to adjust with their role as new parents. They may also otherwise face stresses if the adoption experience does not match what they otherwise might have expected. From working with kinship caregivers, oftentimes they come to care for young people, oftentimes multiple sibling groups with little notice and with little advanced preparation. And really recognizing that as important are child factors to permanency stability, that families truly have the ability to mediate the effect of the child's history of maltreatment and can promote success provided the necessary supports and resources. Now, we also want providers to know enough about the system and to know what resources and supports are available so that they can better be brokers, connectors, and referrers to services. So as part of this initiative, we truly had to take a step back and take a look at how do we best put these into practice, and what does this look like applied into practice. Now, we know that pediatric providers are in a unique position to support adopted children and families, beginning with asking about adoption. And knowing if adoption as part of the family story can be a critical piece of information in assessing and meeting the needs of adopted children and their families, especially if we consider them a population of children and youth with special health care needs. This slide here shows some sample intake questions that actually allow families to indicate whether or not adoption and guardianship was part of their experience. And we put this up because we recognize that this is something that is not necessarily happening outside of these specialized centers and outside of adoption-competent medical homes. In general pediatric practice, the way we find out if adoption was part of the child and family story is oftentimes as we obtain a family history, in which case parents and guardians volunteer that we don't know the medical history because the child is adopted. The other time that this information oftentimes comes up is when you're obtaining a social history and you ask about home environment, and then you find out that adoption might have been part of the family story. The challenge is where they sit within our current scripts and where we identify them, they don't necessarily trigger the follow-up questions and the follow-up assessment to figure out how that child and family are functioning and the potential impact of trauma and the kinds of supports they need. So we truly feel that the first piece here for us to partner and get pediatric providers to partner with children and families and providers is to begin to ask about adoption. Now, if we're to ask about adoption, we need to be mindful about respectful adoption language and behavior, recognizing that the language that we use can have significant positive or negative impact on children and families. While we encourage adoptive parents to talk freely and honestly about adoption from the time their children are young, we recognize that they vary in terms of disclosure, and we truly want our providers to be sensitive around these and to maybe be discreet in terms of how they ask their questions, so that we're also, of course, able to check in terms of where that child and family is in terms of disclosure of adoption status. We want providers who really want to avoid terms that are potentially stigmatizing, such as real child or own child or natural children, and terms such as put up or given up from adoption, which can be potentially, again, like we talked about, stigmatizing. These next action steps are actually modified from a guide that was put together by the American Academy of Pediatrics section on adoption and foster care called Helping Adoptive Families Cope with Trauma. And these action steps highlight steps that we want our pediatricians to be able to concretely take as they work with children and youth in foster and adoption settings. The first is really we want providers to identify trauma. We want providers to assume that all children who have been adopted or fostered have experienced trauma. We also recognize that providers can identify trauma as they review existing diagnosis, depression, ADHD, as we recognize that sometimes the impact of trauma can present and can be confounding with other sort of behavioral diagnoses and comorbidities. They can also identify trauma by reviewing existing diagnosis and by reviewing presenting symptoms with a trauma lens. And there are also screening questions and validated instruments which can be found in the trauma guide, which can be found, information on which can be found in the reference section of this presentation. Again, we want providers who will view the accumulated diagnosis of patients such as ADHD, anxiety, oppositional defiant disorder that young people oftentimes accumulate with a trauma lens and view that sometimes these can be indicative of trauma exposures. Second is about helping families understand trauma and its impact by providing trauma-specific anticipatory guidance. We pediatricians are very good at providing anticipatory guidance, providing families with the information before they need it. At the 2-month visit, before the child begins to roll over, before infants begin to roll over at around 4 months of age, we talk to families about making sure that the rails are up. As the child begins to crawl, we talk about how we put away household poisons. We want to arm families with the information before they need it. We anticipate needs. Similarly, pediatricians can truly educate families about trauma responses and the kinds of responses that children need. That, yes, when parents are most tested by their child's behaviors, or when children most need their parents to be calm and consistent in their responses, as that's what offers the traumatized child the best chance to stabilize and heal. The trauma guide actually provides excellent narratives and excellent scripts for pediatricians and pediatric healthcare providers to use to talk to families about trauma. Third, we want families to be able to refer to evidence-based interventions. Families may come to their pediatricians and healthcare providers with varying needs. They might be seeking reassurance. They might be disconnected from services and supports that may be available to them. And we want our providers to be very good connectors and to have a good understanding of what resources and supports are available in their communities. Lastly, and this is in addition to what's listed in the trauma guide, is we truly want our providers to go above and beyond regular pediatric practice and think about how they can help create and be participants in creating a system that truly meets the needs of children and youth in adoption and foster settings as well as their families. So how do we develop an adoption competent network of providers, and how can we as folks outside the healthcare establishment best engage pediatric healthcare providers in this work? One is truly education, and this webinar is part of this theme. There are plenty of opportunities to engage pediatric healthcare providers, be it in formal venues such as CME programs, but also informal venues that are out there. Second, there may already be providers in specialized child abuse programs or adoption clinics or adoption competent medical homes in your communities. So the other piece here is really figuring out who might already be doing this work in your community that might be a good partner and might be a good collaborator for you and your programs. The third piece here is really recognizing that there is a lot going on in many communities and jurisdictions across the country, specifically around adverse childhood experiences. Here in Phoenix and in Maricopa County, we have a Trauma-Informed Schools initiative and Trauma-Informed Cities initiatives. These, I think what we will find is that we have natural partners within these ACE initiatives and within these consortia. I think the task here might be to identify, if not invite pediatric healthcare providers into the fold of these initiatives, as we certainly speak the same language and we would make for natural partners. Also, reaching out to state American Academy of Pediatric chapters. Every state in the union has an AAP chapter, and there may very well be pediatricians that are already doing this work or have an interest in this work that are in these chapters who might make for natural contacts and partners. Lastly is by initiating conversations and sharing resources about adoption and guardianship. Now, this document here, What Pediatric Healthcare Providers Should Know About Adoption, is something that we have put together as part of the QIC-AG to serve two functions. We see this as an educational tool for pediatric healthcare providers, something that might guide them and walk them through the critical action steps that we had just talked about, that we want them to be mindful of. But we also want this to get in the hands of workers in this field, of families, of parents, and use this document as a way to trigger these conversations and as a way to sort of engage pediatric healthcare providers in learning more and being a part of this work. At this point, here are some reference slides, and you will find information on the trauma guide here. I will pass you on now to Heather Forbes, and will be available for questions at the end of this presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Chilani. We will now hear from Heather Forbes on partnering with schools and teachers. Heather Forbes is the owner of Beyond Consequences Institute and the co-founder of the Codega Foundation. She has worked in the field of trauma and healing since 1999. She is an internationally published author on the topics of raising children with difficult and severe behaviors, the impact of trauma on the developing child, adoptive motherhood, and self-development. Additionally, she has a heart for children in the classroom and for finding ways to teach the children that seems unteachable. Welcome, Heather.
Thank you. It's great to be here. So to piggyback on what we just heard, I'm going to narrow this down into the classroom and what happens to children when they experience typically early childhood trauma, and what happens then in the classroom when they're in a place of stress, in a place of academic challenge. And I think, one of the goals here that I wanted to do was to make sure that I gave you the tools you needed to be able to help our students in the classroom, and what I think the number one piece that we need to have to really educate our educators, because I think in working with the schools in the academic environment, most are trained in a very deeply behavioral approach. And that approach, actually, the example of what we just heard of Gabriel, when he was in his home, it was a more of a behavioral approach, and it only increases negative behaviors. And that is really, it goes across the scale for all kids with any type of trauma, especially ours that are either in foster care or have been adopted. And the reason for that is because this is really what I think to be more of a developmental trauma issue. And the word developmental is really important here, because it is in that developmental journey along the way that our children experience that deep sense of loss and that deep sense of pain and the abandonment, the rejection, all the pieces that come along with the experiences they have through that adoption experience and fostering experience. And we don't always understand the impact. Trauma never goes away, and that's a really hard statement to say, but it may mean that maybe that child has had the first 4 years of his or her life in a very challenging environment. And notice also here on my little diagram that what I have is not just at birth, but I also, and I'm going to highlight this here, is the 9 months in the womb experience is really, really important to consider, because that child may have been in a womb with a birth mother who did not want to be pregnant, and so there's this level of emotional rejection that gets passed along. This is also a mother who may have been under a lot of physical violence, under drug and alcohol exposure, so now you have a brain then that is influenced through very negative chemical the ability to not develop in a correct way because of the drug exposure. And so this is what's important also, is that sometimes kids are adopted at birth. And we sometimes assume, okay, well, we're starting off with a clean slate, we're going to be fine from here. That's not the case always. Adoption at birth, it can be just as traumatic as adoption maybe later down the line. And we have to understand that that baby has the mother's heart rate, the mother's smell, the mother's voice. Everything that baby knows is gone by the time then that baby is born and placed in the loving arms of an adoptive parent. And as much as I am definitely an advocate for adoption, but I think we have to look at it from the child's perspective to understand that their world has completely changed and everything is now unfamiliar. That has a very deep impact on children that ultimately will show up in the classroom. One example, I'd like to give examples of bringing this home. I had a father come up to me one time at one of my trainings, and he was just in tears. I mean, this tall, burly man was up talking to me, and he goes, I never understood. He goes, my daughter is 8 years old. She was adopted at birth, and we have struggled. I mean, we have really, really struggled for the last 8 years, and I've not understood why. And it's because her in utero experience was very, very challenging, and no one was able to identify that for them. So by 8 years old, you can imagine then all those issues are still working through, and then of course in the classroom it was completely falling apart. So these early experiences are very vital, I think, for our educators to understand the impact that this has on the child's nervous system, on the child's brain development, on their perspective of who they are in that world. I think that 8-year-old timeline is also really important to identify, because this is that time in life when kids go through that existential question of asking, who am I? Why am I on this planet? And for a child then that is not in that family of origin, these questions are very big. And this is where also in schools where state testing starts happening. So you'll see a lot of fallout during this time of life as well. Sometimes kids actually do pretty well. But then what I also wanted to see is that, and this is just an example of one child, let's say from 0 to 4 years old, had a very disruptive childhood, and then that child was then placed into a loving home, did pretty well, some struggles, but then all of a sudden what you see next is, bam, by the teenage years, you have a complete fallout, because as much as we know from brain science, this is where the brain is completely changing. It is rewiring. And so all that information then that was dormant in the past now is coming to the future and now to the present moment of rewiring that brain. And that is where then the body system has to sort of deal with all of this. So this is not an issue that just goes away. It is something that continually follows our children. And I hope I'm not being negative here, but it is something that we have to identify and work with. And so it's not just that maybe that child is doing very well 1 year in school, but then all of a sudden 3 years later there's a complete fallout. Just to know that's why. That is why the trauma is not linear. Trauma does not have a timeline. It can show up at any time. Now, the good news on all that is that as that child is able to work through these issues and beyond into adulthood, and every layer of trauma becomes a little bit better to deal with. It can be an expanding moment. It can be a moment of helping our children evolve. But just to, at first, of course, have that understanding of why we're sometimes dealing with this in the classroom. And I think the other piece that is very, very important for our educators to understand, and for all of us to understand, is that this is not a behavioral issue. This is a regulatory issue. And by that I mean that this is an issue internally where that child or student has a very hard time being able to handle stress, be able to soothe themselves back down. When you talk about just a typical child that is not going through negative childhood experiences, this is a child then that is in a loving home, a home that is responsive to the child. The baby, the infant in a home like that is well cared for, meaning that when that baby goes through a high state of stress, maybe that baby is hungry or tired or just needs some rocking, the baby cries out. That is a baby that is eliciting attention, that is eliciting that need for regulation. And again, in that healthy home, that parent comes in rocks the baby, feeds the baby, calms that baby down. That kind of cycling happens how many times? Numerous times just in one day, and then you carry that over 4 or 5 years of the early childhood. That then is a child that learns to go through that high state of stress, and then within the context of relationship is able to come down to a place of regulation. And so those times of stress don't become scary because there's always support. There's always someone there to help that child be able to come into a place of calm again. And that's a dynamic pattern that children in healthy households learn. Well, then you take the opposite, where our children, where they didn't have that soothing, didn't have that calming. In fact, many times they had a lot of negativity when they were upset, and you put that on top. You have children now who, when they get into that high state of arousal, they stay there. And so 2 terms here to look at, one being regulation and one is dysregulation. Regulation, just by definition, is the experience to maintain stress within one's window of tolerance, generally referred to as being calm, focused, or relaxed. The term is utilized by literally every scientific discipline. So when a child is behaving in a responsive way in the classroom, sitting still, raising their hand, paying attention, focusing, that is a child that's not a good behavior child. What I want us to see, that is a child that is regulated. Their behaviors are indicative of a state of a regulation. For a child then that is dysregulated, it's just simply the experience of stress outside of one's window of tolerance, generally referred to as being stressed out or in a state of distress. And this is a big statement from Dr. Alan Shore. He says, it is believed that affect dysregulation is a fundamental mechanism involved in all psychiatric disorders. So what you will see then is a lot of our children are diagnosed with what we had already mentioned, conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder, ADHD, the whole gamut of these. And so underneath it, what I see is that these are children who just are in a chronic state of dysregulation. And what does that look like then in the classroom? Well, then that looks like a child then that is not behaving. So let's take it from the perspective and the timeline, so to speak, of the regulation versus dysregulation, and look at it from a behavioral level. So on the left-hand side here, I have hyperarousal. So in a state of dysregulation where a student is hyperaroused, these are the outwardly focused behaviors, unable to focus or sit still, can't adhere to rules. And notice I say cannot instead of will not, because that's another shift in our understanding that this is not intentional. This is not about having a child sit down and make a better choice. They literally cannot regulate their physiological bodies back down to a state of calm because they have not had those continual experiences like I talked about with that infant. And then we also have kids who are aggressive because they live in a state of fear. When you feel like you are being threatened, you will act out to protect yourself. These are students that live in a state of survival. And again, these may have been children that have been pulled out of their very negative environments for the last 5 or 6 years, like we saw on that timeline, but they're still living in survival. I've been mentoring a lady for the last 8 years, and we had a conversation about this the other day, is that she still feels like her brain is in survival. And being able to turn that off and to feel safe, even though she knows she's safe, she has a cognitive ability to understand that. She knows that she's older and she's not powerless, but the body system is still on alert all the time. And so these are kids that will act out very, very easily without any what we call impulse control. Kids who are resistant to directives, argumentative. And you know, the argumentative piece is huge. A lot of times this may also be a language issue. You know, here's an example that I think is very indicative of where our kids are on their understanding of language is that, let's say a teacher says, okay, in the story, Johnny went to the grocery. And then your student who has this childhood history, well, they don't raise their hand because they're too impulsive. So they yell out and they say, he didn't go to the grocery, he went to the market. Because in the story, the book said market. But because we know the nuances of language, now we have a teacher that says, well, grocery market, not a big deal. And your Billy says, no, it is a big deal, because they're very rigid and they're thinking very, very concrete, and they're thinking, because that's what trauma does. And Billy says, no, it was the market. It says it right here. You're lying to me. And so now we get into this amazing argument all over the choice of 2 different words. And that's because children don't learn language in the same way when they're in difficult, challenging environments as they do when they're in loving, relationship-based environments, because they don't have the interaction with adults that our typical kids do. So here's the list on the hyperarousal for you as well. And then the hypoarousal on the other side of the spectrum, then we have hypo. This is the children who shut down, who withdraw, who pull everything inward. They blame themselves, they hit themselves, they're defiant, they just say no, or maybe they walk in the classroom with their hoodie on their head and they sit in the back of the classroom and they ignore everybody, ignore the teacher, they don't say a word. These are the kids that are so overwhelmed with so much stress that they have to shut all that down. And these are, I think, the harder kids to reach. They're the ones that are tardy or absent. They just disassociate, or in just layman's terms, they just shut down. They avoid. They numb out. They put an air about them that says, I don't care. Or maybe they even say out loud, I don't care. This is a way to shut the world out because the world is too big for them. They are in that chronic state of dysregulation. And so, again, getting our educators to understand, not from a behavioral aspect. These are just signals. What I really want us to start looking at then is how, when we see students who are dysregulated, how do we move them back into a state of regulation? Because when you are in a state of regulation, what behaviors do you have? Well, you have a student who is responsive, engaged, focused, calm. These are what we have unfortunately termed as the good students. Well, all our kids have the potentiality of being good in the sense that all of us can learn to be regulated. And when we focus then not on the behaviors but focus on these terms of either regulation or dysregulation, it can literally change everything about the culture of a school. I'm in Boulder, Colorado, and I gave just a 45-minute training. Basically these slides and a few more one time at a school that was K through 8 school. And I left. And then I came back a year later, and I asked the principal and vice principal, I said, how are things going? And they said, everything has changed. And I was like, I was only there for 45 minutes. They said, when we could finally see our students as being dysregulated rather than being bad, non-compliant, and all these terms that we put on our students, it changed how we were able to interact. And the interaction then comes through relationships, so that when you see a student who is dysregulated, instead of punishing them or threatening punishment, or even the opposite of giving them some sort of incentive to say, hey, Billy, if you finish your homework up, you'll get a sticker on the sticker chart. If you get all the stickers, you get to go to Fun Friday. Those types of incentives are actually stress-inducing for our students, because it's not about making a different choice. It's learning how to regulate. And so when there's this promise of a toy or promise of this Fun Friday, that adds more stress. So then you've got a student who already is stressed out. You add more stress, and then you have this decompensation of the student who continually then goes into a deeper state of dysregulation. Then, of course, what that looks like is a more negative behavior. So changing our terminology is going to be very important. And for parents then to be able to help the school understand their children, we don't have to give their whole background. That's their private information. That's our family private information. But we do need to help them understand that this student doesn't know how to move from a state of dysregulation into a state of regulation. That self-regulatory ability has been compromised over and over and over again, even for many of our teenagers. And this is why you have a lot of teenagers then seeking outside external resources such as pot or drugs or alcohol or sex, because they're trying to regulate their bodies back down to get to that state of calm. And it only lasts, of course, for just a little while. Then they got to keep repeating the same pattern. So look at the behaviors of what our students are doing, and from the eyes of regulation and dysregulation, and you will start to see why they're doing the things that they're doing. What they're doing, those behaviors, are not about trying to get away with it. Although I will say, sometimes it looks that way and it feels that way, but it really truly is more about them. It is more about how can I be able to settle down my system. So for parents, I think that to be able to bring them in this terminology is going to be critical to helping our students move in that academic direction. And the other term I think that is really important that we can use, instead of, again, giving a whole history, is to say, look, my child has a high sensitivity to stress. That really sums it up. These are students that have a very challenging time being able to modulate high levels of stress. and not even just high levels, but just sort of typical academic levels of stress, which are, they're very challenging for our students. We are in a world where it's all about academic achievement, and now we're throwing our children into that environment with a compromised ability to do that. So that little chart, I think, is very, very valuable. And then to be able to write all that up into either a behavioral plan, a 504 plan. If your child is adopted or in foster care, they are automatically eligible for a 504 plan because you can say that they have a high sensitivity to stress, bottom line. And that will at least get them prepared to be able to have those special interventions with a 504 plan. Many of our students, of course, then do actually qualify for an IEP, and then the IEP needs to be written in these terms, written in the terms of not about how many times Billy is going to do this behavior, but how many times Billy was able to recover from a state of dysregulation to a state of regulation. And there is a way to quantify that, and I'm going to give you some resources at the end of this that help you then to literally do new wording in IEPs and new wording in behavior plans that are based off of regulation and dysregulation versus the behavioral approach. And really the whole piece of this webinar is to say, how can then we look at the systems around our children? We have obviously the family system, but when you have a student that then is in school, you're inviting a whole other circle of people and the systems into that, which can either be extremely helpful or in many cases very detrimental. But these two environments it's imperative to get our children into an environment that is going to support who they are and what the trauma has done to their psychological systems and their physiological systems. And these two are the absolute most because especially young children, they spend 98% of their time in these two environments. And we have to come together. It is imperative. If a child has a great loving home, goes to a school that doesn't support them in their lack of abilities to regulate, then everything in the home starts crumbling down. So joining these two are, that's why my work has led past just families, but including then the school environment. And from my own personal experience, my daughter, the only reason I believe that she is successful today, in fact, I had to brag, I dropped her off at grad school last week. The only reason she was able to do that was not because of me, but because I was able to get a school environment on board and understanding this. That was everything to who she is today. And then what we also have as far as that outreach around us, we have then outside the school, as we just heard, the medical community, different agencies, CPS, churches or institutes of religion, police. Sometimes that can be a negative if we don't catch them in time. And then after-school programs and government agencies. And so I believe it is our goal to educate everybody around these adoption issues, because when it comes down to it, every single one of these, when it comes back to that child in that home trying to function as a healthy family, it takes literally a village for all of these agencies and people to be able to come together to understand that. So that's why I think it's imperative when we are working with our children in the school, in the home, to be able to get them back into a place that they can feel safe, emotionally regulated, and then be able to really develop their best academic skills and find that level of healing. So the resources I want to give to you to be able to make that happen, please go visit my website. This is what I do. This is what I'm passionate about. I've got tons of resources on there that are just free downloads. My book, Help for Billy, is all about what I just talked about and much more in depth. And again, if you're looking for how do you make that happen in the school with the right wording and how do we help teachers have the actual tools, that book is great. There's a couple other resources I have here listed I think are good as well. Dr. Bruce Perry's work at the Child Trauma Academy has lots of resources. And I also recommend this, is that any resources for children that have been diagnosed with autism are wonderful for our students, because that is where our kids are lacking developmentally, is in their social and emotional languages, their ability to be able to function at their grade level. We got to bring them up to speed. And those resources very much address that from a very direct standpoint. All right, so I'm going to hand this back over to Leslie.
Thank you, Heather. That was terrific. Barb Joyle is now going to share her experiences on creating a systems-level therapeutic web. Barb is a graduate of McGill University School of Social Work with a concentration in Child and Family Studies. She is employed by the state of Vermont as a Systems of Care Unit Director for the Family Services Division. Her current work focuses on supporting family-based care in Vermont, including recruitment, development, and support of foster kin care resources, improving permanency practice and the delivery of trauma-informed post-permanency services to children and families. Welcome, Barb.
Thank you, Leslie. Hi, it's a pleasure to be here today to share with you a little bit about the quick intervention in Vermont. I'll start out by just talking a little bit about at the onset of our quick project, Vermont had a pretty robust continuum of pre and post-adoption and guardianship services. But what we realized was that we didn't know a ton about the overall well-being of the families who had formed through a child welfare adoption or a guardianship over the long haul. And so we also didn't have a really great way to stay in contact with those families over time, or any kind of really great strategy for maintaining contact with those families. So we decided that we needed to figure out a way to move forward around those issues. So we developed our Vermont Permanency Survey. The survey itself utilized questions borrowed with permission from other normed tools, and they helped us to get at issues related to caregiver strain and caregiver stress, and just to try to really start to unpack some of the well-being challenges that families are faced with. So these normed tools allowed us to have fidelity and to support our ability to use the information that we gathered in a reliable, predictive way. And so what has been happening is that the information that we're gleaning from our survey is actually helping us to inform our practice pre-finalization all the way through to post-permanency practice, and really to evaluate how our overall system of care is attending to the needs of families from a service delivery perspective. So this survey was delivered to all families in our state who received adoption or guardianship assistance. So these 4 items that you see up here, I'm just going to take us quickly through these topics, and I want to make sure that I leave time for my colleague John, so I'll just zip through these. So primarily what we did is we needed to really identify what it is we wanted to learn from this survey, and so we convened a group of parents, and we asked them a lot of questions about their experiences, and so they helped us to form topic areas and questions that would form our survey. And our survey, I will say, was very lengthy, over 20 pages, and we've had probably a 55% response rate across our system. So it's remarkable that folks have been willing to share to the extent that they have, and we've gotten some really great information. So in addition to talking with parents, we had a site advisory team that we convened. We have been convening throughout our entire project, and they helped us to kind of fine-tune and refine our questions so that we were ensure that we were really going to get at the issues we wanted to attend to. It's really interesting and probably not unusual for those of you working in the field. There's a lot of overlap in terms of the provider community who are themselves adoptive parents or parenting through guardianship. And so some of them had dual roles in that, which we felt was fine and actually helped our process. If you want to move on to the next slide. And I think we can skip through this one. All right. So we're in the phase right now. Our intervention has been fully implemented. We are in the process of analyzing the data that we've received back. And we made a commitment that we were going to reach out to Vermont is a pretty small, very rural state. And the communities have very distinct personalities, and so we wanted to be able to report the information back to the field in connection to the specific region that the information is coming from. So we made use of already existing standing meetings that happen on a regular basis in those regions. And those teams are interagency teams, which typically include folks from child protection, folks from our local community mental health, as well as our agency on education, and our early childhood system of care providers are also at the table. In addition, I did say education, yes, education folks are at the table as well. So it's a pretty good cross-section of disciplines that meet together on a regular basis. And so we wanted to make sure that we were inclusive of all of those disciplines in order to kind of broaden our focus and make sure that we were reaching everybody for whom this information might be relevant. We also have been able to make some use of social media. There's a Facebook page that operates in Vermont that reaches an even broader audience. There are, I want to say, maybe 2,200 members at this point. And the page's emphasis is to engage professionals and communities and to share information, resources, and ideas about improving the lives of children and families impacted by trauma. And you're welcome to check out that page at the Vermont Trauma Lens on Facebook. In keeping with the other two speakers before me, we have been working, this is our last year of our project, and we're working on dissemination. And this year on the docket for us is to engage what we call the BEST Institute, which is sponsored by the Agency of Education, and it's advanced training for educators. And so our plan is to be a presence and hopefully get an invitation to present at their summer institute. They have one each summer, and so we will at very least be a presence there, but our hope is to be able to do some reporting out about some of these issues, and also to share some of the other quick resources related to education, similar to what Heather was sharing before me. At the same time, we are working to engage our local chapter of the American Association on Pediatrics in a similar way to disseminate our quick products there and to share with them what's happening on the ground here with families formed by adoption or guardianship and how they might be able to be supported in maybe different ways or to sort of enhance their practice. If we can move to the next slide. So what has all of this done to affect practice in Vermont? It's still a little bit early in our process to point definitively toward an improvement in practice, but what's happened is we've been able to share details about what families are telling us about what's working well for them and what supports they still need or what supports they're having difficulty accessing due to capacity issues within other parts of our system of care. The survey has opened up some opportunities to revisit dialogue about the impact of trauma on families formed by adoption or guardianship. And this project has really provided information to indicate that most families are really doing well, and has given us an opportunity to revisit those situations where there are challenges and to look at our practice en route to adoption, to look at the trauma experiences and the treatment interventions available to the child en route to legal finalizations, to see if we can do a better job with assessment or if we miss something and we're not able to provide optimal supports. We are currently moving into a capacity building stage where we're looking at a tool that we designed based on some information provided by the QIC related to risk and protective factors. And we developed a screening tool that our folks working on adoption finalization use with the child and family to identify risks and protective factors, and not to screen a family in or out, but to say what kind of supports are you going to need over the long haul, likely to sustain this and to have the best well-being outcome possible. So that's very promising, and we have in our post-permanency supports, we have in our contracts we have included the use of this tool as a screening for families, and so we're really looking forward, and families were part of developing that as well. So that's been really, I think, a valuable piece of the outcome of this work. We're also looking at sort of revamping our work for our new family services social worker trainings to make sure that at the foundational level, new workers coming in are being oriented to robust permanency practice. We throw a lot at the new workers very early on, and we want to make sure that they're very strongly oriented to permanency practice and the impact that can have on case outcomes in general, but well-being outcomes more specifically. We've also wanted to do some work to kind of dispel some of the myths that we as a system had believed previously about, once families get to the point of finalization, it's like crossing the finish line and they're happy to be done with the system. We believe that, and we've come to believe that that's a myth, and that families really do want to maintain their connection to the child welfare system in a supportive way. There's a shift, and it absolutely should be there. But when they need supports, they need to know that there's a place that they can go to access them, and that they're readily available. So the survey also started to inform some practice areas that that we need to attend to. We learned that many families formed by adoption or guardianship are not talking much about the adoption themes or birth family in their family. The parents aren't bringing it up, and the kids are not bringing it up, and so there's some assumption that's going on that, well, maybe they're not thinking about it. And so we really want to unpack that and start to attend to that, because we absolutely know that children who have a cohesive narrative have a better sense of who they are in the world and how all of this has affected them. And so we are going to be having in this year, we're going to be working on pulling together, we're calling it an adoption summit, but we're going to have an opportunity for caregivers to come together, and we're going to bring speakers to kind of talk about this and have a panel of youth who have been able to maintain connections and who have had the opportunity of a coherent narrative in their life and the impact that that's had for them. And so that's still forming up for us at this stage. We were also talking about the role, I mentioned just a second ago about maintaining connections, and I think we still have a little bit of work to do here in terms of why is that important, and how can you sustain that in a way that feels safe and meets the needs of your child. So that will be a part of that summit as well. Lastly, in this section, I want to be able to address the fact that our survey identified a need for the development of additional adoption competent mental health practitioners in our state. And we currently are exploring some strategies of how to increase our knowledge and skill and capacity in this area. We've started to explore opportunities to partner with the National Adoption Competency and Mental Health Training Initiative, and we hope that they will be able to support us in some implementation down the road after a little bit. And the last section I want to talk about is just a tiny bit about some of the challenges. For us, we're a small state, and folks working in adoption and our community mental health, it's a smallish number of folks. And so what I will say is that we had done a lot of work to open those lines of communication and to develop relationships and trust. And so what we did was capitalize on that. We made use of those already existing partnerships. And right from the beginning, as we were trying to identify even what our intervention would be, those folks were at the table, and we formed our thinking together around that. So they were part of the identification of the challenge, the assessment of the strengths and gaps in our continuum, and then the development of the intervention. And so naturally they've been included in conversations related to what we've learned and our planning related to sustainability. So it's a very exciting time in Vermont around our system of care as it relates to adoption and guardianship, and I appreciate the opportunity to share about that. Leslie?
Yes, thank you. I want to take a moment to remind folks that you can ask questions by typing in to the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. John will be our last speaker, so we'll get to questions right after he's completed. So John is going to share with us some of his experiences in creating networks through the QIC-AG in New Jersey. John Webb is the Site Implementation Manager for the New Jersey Department of Children and Families, QIC-AG project. John recently coordinated New Jersey's implementation of a randomized control trial designed to improve regional and legal permanence for youth legally free for 18 months or longer without an identified home, titled NJ Cares. Welcome, John.
Hello, thanks, and I'll get us through to the finish line. On my first slide that you'll see here coming up you'll see that we're going to talk a little bit about how New Jersey connected with our chapter of the AAP. We had never really been asked to think about our relationship with the medical community until the idea for the Ask About Adoption document was being designed and ultimately created. So it turned out to be a good opportunity to examine what that relationship was and how we could build a bridge to that community to share the work that was created by the QIC-AG. We decided to first look internally at our potential contacts that could connect us to the medical world. We were able to secure a meeting with our department's clinical services division, and that turned out to be a really good first step, as they were able to connect us to the New Jersey chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. We presented the Ask About Adoption document first to our clinical services staff, who really felt that the information was important and well presented. They were able to become a liaison to the NJAAP and set up an in-person meeting with staff from that agency. I believe one of the reasons we were ultimately successful was that that relationship was created with our internal staff first, allowing them to open the door to folks in the community that adoption operations had not previously worked with. If we had attempted to outreach directly to the NJAAP, we may have been met with more resistance. So members of the NJAAP, Adoption Ops, and the Office of Clinical Services sat down to a lengthy meeting where we discussed a few different options for dissemination of the Ask About Adoption document. We discussed some events that they had upcoming and where we could distribute the information, how it might look, but where we ultimately landed our biggest distribution efforts would be around the AAP's quarterly magazine. We developed a plan to insert our Ask About Adoption document into their June 2018 quarterly magazine that is distributed to 1,900 pediatricians across the state. This would be a great opportunity and give us the best chance to have the right eyeballs looking at that information. Connecting with the AAP was only one of the ways we helped create support for our families. As part of our intervention outreach, we contacted hundreds of families who have adopted or assumed legal guardianship of a child from the foster care system. With that, as you might imagine, came some questions. When we did outreach to families, we had adoption experienced staff making calls and registering families for our intervention. So any family that we spoke to had the opportunity to speak to a professional in the field, and if the family had questions or concerns not related to our intervention, they could be easily referred to the right place for answers. We felt this was key, as many of the families we reached out to had not been in contact with our agency for some time, so we needed to be prepared to answer a variety of questions. Families that were able to attend the intervention were provided service booklets, specifically tailored for the post-adoption family in New Jersey. In addition, the trainers of our intervention were experienced adoption professionals. New Jersey is a resource-rich state, and we really focus on providing families opportunities to connect to existing services that were free and community-based. I believe this is a strong secondary element of our outreach to families. Most of the work we have done on this grant is guided by our stakeholder team. This is a group of individuals with strong ties to the adoption world, whether it be as an adoptive parent, adoption-specific clinician, kinship parent, adopted child, or international adoptive family. This group helped us create an atmosphere that would be most comfortable for families to receive our message. They helped us with wording on invitations, finding community locations that supported adoptive families, and distributing material like the Ask About Adoption documents to other key stakeholders in the community. Our stakeholder team was a real strong point of our work in New Jersey. Like with most things in our field, there are some inherent challenges that come along with collaboration and systems trying to stay connected. Everyone's cause is the most important, meaning the folks that work in behavioral health or mental health or autism or education and so on all feel that their work should be amplified. We are no different in the adoption world, often wrestling with the changing priorities for providers who look to serve the most youth and families as possible. It's tough to stand out. One way we were able to combat some of that was by having our requests be easy to work with for the provider. An example of that is back to our collaboration with AAP. QIC-AG had done all the work, created a great document in color, might I add, with numerous resources attached. In my meeting with the AAP, I was able to leave them copies of the document to hold in their office, and when we planned to insert the document into the quarterly magazine, we simply shipped 1,900 copies to the packaging company. So we were plug and play. We didn't approach AAP without a finished product, and our requests didn't add additional work to their schedules. We made it as easy as possible to be a partner, and I believe that really helped. So as we continue to utilize the relationships we've built in this process, we will also take some time to assess any gaps in service we feel may exist. Using the lessons learned about partnering with agencies, we hope to expand our message both through the use of the Ask About Adoption documents and our continued focus on supporting families post-permanency. Connecting families to resources and supports always seems easier when the agencies that run these programs are connected. So with that, I'd like to say thank you and turn the presentation back over to Leslie Cohen to facilitate some questions.
Thank you, John. And Melinda List will now moderate the question and answer portion of our webinar.
Well, at this time we have one question, and Barb, this is for you. Carrie's wanting to know if she can see the screen tool that you mentioned during your presentation.
Yes, I think we can make that available. I know that it'll have to go through the quick folks in order to do that. So that's y'all. You have to make that decision.
Thanks, Barb. All right, Carrie, so we'll get back to you on that. Any other questions that people have, you can either raise your hand or type your question in the participant feedback area. There's so much information given today, so think about it for a minute from two perspectives from sites and also a doctor and someone who specializes in trauma in the schools. Okay, Lygia, I love the idea of connecting with families at the right time. Can New Jersey elaborate on that a little bit? John, that's for you.
Yeah, sure. So we looked at our intervention, which was a parenting workshop program for families, as something that would fit a lot of different families, but we really tried to target the families at the time that they would be most needy. So we focused on families with youth ages 10 to 13. It's often a tough time with youth going through some identity changes and some physical and emotional changes that adolescence brings on. So we really tried to be there at that time for that family with our intervention that was designed to help families in that situation.
This is Barb. I'd like to add to that. In Vermont, the risk and protective factors screening that I mentioned, we end up using that as a way, so that tool ends up identifying a level of risk, and that for us in Vermont is connected to how often we're reaching back out to families after legal finalization. So if a family and child combination pops high in terms of risk, then they're going to get reached out to on a more frequent basis from folks here in Vermont. And it's a way, like, we never let them get away anymore. We want to sustain that contact over time so that they don't feel like, they don't have a safety net. Sorry.
Thanks, Barb. Okay, we have another question from Stephanie. Heather, this is for you. It says, I understand you've been hosting conference days for school personnel. How receptive have those worked? How receptive have those worked been to shift from behavior-based strategies to those that are more trauma-informed?
No, it's a great question, and I am excited to give you an answer that is very positive. It is shifting, and there is a huge shift. In fact, I'm leaving just this weekend for a conference out in Sacramento, and we're having 900 people at that one. The one we had in St. Louis was 1,500 people. So you can see that the numbers are big, and people are really reaching for this information because what they're doing currently, they're realizing isn't working. And so I believe that there is definitely a momentum building, and it's only going to get bigger. So I'm very excited to be able to hear about that. And we heard also in Phoenix that there's a trauma-informed initiative. So I see it popping up all over the United States, and sometimes it's a state mandate, sometimes it's local, but we are definitely moving in that direction.
Okay, Barb, I have a question for you from Bernice. Do you get permission from the parents to reach out to them?
Yes, we do.
Okay. So I want to just remind everyone there's a survey they're going to get. Please fill that out. It does help us. I apologize again for the technology difficulties we had at the beginning of our webinar. That doesn't usually happen, so you have to learn to go with it, right? That's what all the Adoption Continuum is about, being able to adapt. I want to really thank all of our speakers today, John and Barb, for all their time that they've done on this project and for sharing what their sites have been doing, and Dr. Chelani and Heather for their great information. There are documents up on our website, which is listed there on this last slide for Ask About Adoption. There's one for pediatricians and there's one for educators. I encourage you to go and get those. It's a great resource for families to bring to the school, bring to their doctor's office, for sites to share with their local partners. And there's also a little video there of Heather talking a little bit about what she did today, which is a real quick video, also great for schools. And soon we'll have a similar video up with Dr. Chelani talking about it for the pediatrician side.